nuisance texts. 175,000 people made a formal complaint last year about cold calls. At the moment, it has to be proved that the call has caused substantial distress, but the government says that threshold will be lowered and penalties will include fining companies up to £500,000.
Well, joining us now are David Hickson, who runs the Fair Telecoms campaign against cold calling, and Mike Lordan. He's the chief of the operations at Direct Marketing Association, which represents the UK telemarketing industry. And if we may talk from the perspective of the telemarketers, first of all, we were hearing from the executive director of Which, who said that these calls are an everyday menace, blighting the lives of millions. Is that a fair description?
I think absolutely, and we've been calling for this exactly this legislation to be amended for quite some time. It's hugely damaging to the legitimate industry, which makes, of course, a fraction of these calls.
So you're saying that, in a way, responsible companies are not making these calls at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our banner of our code is responsible marketing, and responsible marketing isn't making these calls in breach of the telephone preference service or other regulations or legislations that's in law, and they needed strengthening, and we've been calling for that strengthening. We're pleased to see it, to enable the legitimate industry to do its business legitimately.
David, so what do you make of what's been announced today?
What's been announced today is nothing more than a tiny bit of tidying up of a little loophole that somebody managed to crawl through to escape a fine. Just in one case, this little loophole about likely to cause substantial damage or substantial distress, they claimed before a tribunal hadn't been proved in their case, and for some perverse reason the tribunal accepted this argument. Therefore, it makes sense to say, well, so in case somebody else might crawl through that one again, let's get rid of it.
But you're saying it's not going to stop the problem?
It's not going to stop the problem, no. This is just a tiny bit of tidying up, I should say.
So how do you stop the problem?
We accept that the Information Commissioner's Office over 10 years has failed to implement and enforce this regulation, and we look at other ways in which it can be done more effectively. If we take each sector where this happens, each sector has got its own industry regulator. The claims management companies, the PPI calls, the have you had an accident people, they have their own regulator who could make a very simple rule, and I'm sure Mike and his members would support it, which would say, for this industry alone, the telephone is not an appropriate means to use to get business. These companies are licensed, so if a rule was brought into that effect, neither they nor the agents who work on their behalf, often from overseas, could hope to do business by gathering business by telephone. If it was completely shut down for that sector, the claims management regulator has very strong enforcement powers which dwarf the powers of the Information Commissioner because they hold life and death power over these companies.
Mike, it's an interesting point that David's making there, saying in a way it's not appropriate for a lot of companies to even be contacting people in this way. Just give us a sense, though, of why you think it is, assuming you do, important for some industries to be able to reach people in this way, considering how many people we've had getting in touch saying it drives me nuts to have these calls.
I mean, if I may just respond to one of Dave's points, I do think it is significant. I don't think it solves the problem. It isn't a silver bullet, to use that expression, and we do need other regulation and legislation around it. But if I go away from what industry sectors more to the people, there's still some 5 million people in the UK that don't have access to the internet, and I think used correctly and properly, and I do stress that, correctly and properly by the legitimate industry can be a useful thing for consumers to be contacted.
But what does that mean, correctly and properly? You're still calling people up when they don't necessarily want to be called, or they're not expecting a call?
No, not calling if you're registered on the telephone preference service, and there are some 20 million landlines registered on there. So not calling if you're registered on the telephone preference service.
What is the telephone preference service?
Telephone preference service is a service that's run by Ofcom that the telephone preference service operate, where companies should screen any call list that they're doing. They're making calls to against the telephone preference service to ensure they don't call those calls. Now, unfortunately, many companies, these what as we term, rogue companies don't do this, and that's why we're pleased that this loophole, as Dave describes it, although I think it's a bit more significant than Dave believes, it has been brought into
Still, the
legislation.
essential complaint from people, from our viewers, from a lot of people out there is, I get called up, I get a text, I don't want it.
Well, text is again another matter, and this is where I think it may make even a bigger difference in the area of text. The new proposed regular legislation, that people don't want it, and they should give their permission. But these companies, especially phoning from overseas, although a lot of them doing it on behalf of British companies, are breaching regulations, and we need to see that stopped.
David, just a final brief thought to you, if we may. What about technology? Is there some way that we could be helped by something that at least shows us who's calling so we have a choice?
What is important is that everybody has access, until we have cracked this and by regulation stopped it, effective call filtering devices. There are devices that you can plug into your landline around at the moment. We're hoping there are movements in technology that will mean the same effective facility to monitor calls, and if you don't recognise the number, the person calling may perhaps have a chance to say who they are if they wanted to clear themselves, but moving that onto the telephone network. So you don't have to have a little box of tricks plugged in your home, and indeed you could even have it on your mobile as well. We look to when we can move forward in that direction, which will help people to take more control of their own calls, and indeed if they don't want to call from their mother-in-law, they can put her temporarily on the blacklist.
Now that's a whole other debate. I don't think we should get into that.
Yeah, can of worms there. David Hickson, Mike Lordan, thanks very much for your time this afternoon.